We can hear you now. Welcome.
Good.
Welcome,
Thank you.
Vanessa. Thank you so much for accepting our invite. So I'm just gonna give like a brief introduction to you. Then we can dive into the current events regarding what's happening in Syria. So for the
Mhm.
listeners, Vanessa Beeley is a British investigative journalist who has spent years reporting from the ground in Syria, documenting the realities of the conflict, often ignored by Western media, mainstream media, should I say. Known for challenging dominant narratives and highlighting the voices of civilians in Syria, she has become a key independent voice on the war, Western interventions, and groups like the White Helmet. Welcome, Vanessa, once again.
Thank you
So,
so much for inviting me.
my pleasure. So, we're not gonna, because our time is short, so we're not gonna go into the history of the dirty war in Syria. We're just gonna talk about like the latest events from the fall of the Assad government until now, what happened. So, in the late 2024, one day after the ceasefire between the Lebanese government and the Israelis indirectly, HTS launched a lightning offensive that quickly swept through Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus. And by December 8, the Assad government collapsed. And Ahmed al-Shara, better known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani, took control, initiating a transitional phase under HTS-led governance. In the aftermath, we've seen nothing but violence, and which was, deeply sectarian. For example, in March 2025, there was reports of systematic massacres of the Alawites along the Syrian coast, in Latakia and Tartus, where many civilians have died. They were described as systematic genocide by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and now we are seeing these events, similar events, unfolding in Suwaida between the Druze community and the so-called, the Bedouins. What are your thoughts about what's going on, and where does Syria stand now? And is there any real path to stability under this transitional government?
I'll answer that part of the question first. Look, I know that there is a lot of loss of hope, even among Syrians, since the fall of Damascus back in December 2024, which was especially after the assassination of Syed Hassan in Lebanon and other, very well-loved leaders from Hezbollah and Hamas, well-loved, of course, in Syria. The trauma of that, and then combined with the very sudden 10-day collapse of the Syrian government and, to a degree, the Syrian military. I would argue that the Syrian army did not surrender. It was effectively betrayed on multiple fronts. But anyway, coming back to the fact that the Syrian people have been living through this trauma for however many months it is now. And of course, they've seen the Takfiri project expand throughout Syria, carrying out ethnic cleansing pogroms on the coast and in Homs, in Hama, in virtually all areas, actually. And this has escalated to what is happening now with effectively the ethnic cleansing of the Druze. I want to clarify that the Druze is not one homogeneous faction or sect. There are multiple policies within the Druze sect itself in Syria and, of course, in Israel and in Lebanon. So it's a fairly complex situation from the perspective of the Druze. But from my experience, I was with the Druze communities for some time in 2018 and 2019 after the ISIS massacre of 2018. So I spent a lot of time with them, and I would say that the huge majority are both against Israel and against Takfiri occupation. And those factions are currently the ones that are being targeted by Jolani through the tribal factions proxies, because much is being made also by Jolani and his media to create the sectarian divide between the tribal elements from Syria and the Druze. However, historically, the Druze and the Bedouin, the tribal elements, have lived peacefully, coexisted peacefully for centuries, probably 1,000 years. And so therefore it becomes clear when you look at Jolani's rhetoric, he's playing both sides against the other. He's actually inciting the sectarian bloodlust among the tribal factions, and he's releasing them as a proxy to carry out his dirty work against the Druze on behalf of Israel. And it's no surprise that this conflict between the Druze and the tribal factions escalated just after Jolani returned from the meeting in Baku, where he clearly met with a representative of Netanyahu. And in my opinion, they discussed the so-called security agreement between Israel and Syria, because Jolani is not quite yet prepared to go as far as full normalization, although he did call Israel the state of Israel today, so one can assume that he's heading in that direction. But there are elements in Israel that are also against a full normalization with what is effectively an unelected al-Qaeda regime in Syria that may threaten Israel, if not now, in the future. And so as soon as Jolani came back, the escalation commenced against the Druze. And in my opinion, the escalation is against the Druze factions that oppose both Israel and al-Qaeda. And that becomes clear when one looks at the communities that are actually being targeted. And when I'm speaking to people on the ground, they're telling me, look, Vanessa, the minority is pro-Israel in Syria, but we are the ones that are getting targeted. And we're seeing the factions that are under the control of Laith al-Balous pivoting towards Jolani, and the factions that are under the control of Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, who of course was leading the separatist movement prior to the fall of the Syrian government, also with the backing of Israel. So effectively, there's a huge amount of other detail that I could go into. But effectively, in my opinion, Jolani is running this ethnic cleansing program against the Druze to bring them to a level where they look for Israeli protection, which means then that Israel can move in the Druze factions in Israel and in Syria that support Israel as a proxy settlement force within Sweda that then enables Israel to a degree, move military into the area and start expanding into the David's corridor, which is the corridor planned by the Zionist entity to head eastwards along the Jordan and Iraqi border, link with the Kurdish factions that, of course, are also sympathetic to Israel and the United States, and eventually link with the Euphrates. And of course, we have to remember that Donald Trump is seeing everything in Syria through the Israeli lens. He's not seeing it through a Turkish lens. He's not seeing it through a Russian lens for sure, although I would say Russia now is collaborating far more with Israel in order to secure its own base on the coast.
So, like the end goal, would you say that the end goal of Israel by weaponizing the Druze minorities is to pretty much secure the David corridor to perhaps in the future, in case of a confrontation with Iran, that would be much easier for them?
I don't think it's necessarily related to a war, the long war with Iran, because they can use Syrian airspace, which was one of the objectives of toppling the Syrian government, of course. They have free reign in Syrian airspace. But I do think from a resource perspective, and from the expansion of the Zionist project, and also from a collective West perspective, the redrawing of the Sykes-Picot borders into the new Middle East, which of course is what they've been working towards. And that's why you find the British and MI6 actively rebranding Jolani, actively training al-Qaeda in some kind of semblance of governance, which of course is rapidly unraveling. And so I think the main role of the minority Druze and of the tribal factions to put the pressure on the Druze that might be currently against Israel to accept Israel because it's better than Jolani and the tribal factions. And of course, that's what we've been seeing with the Alawites in the coastal area. They've been asking for international intervention. Some factions have been saying that they would welcome a French mandate again if it protects them from Jolani. So this is also Jolani's role, to make life so unbearable for Syrian minorities that they either emigrate, because of course this is another part of the plan, is to force the minorities, particularly the Christians, to leave the region in order to eventually leave the region open to what will be a war between the resistance and the GCC Takfiri project, of course, backed by the Zionists.
I see. So like it's pretty much to plunge the whole region in never-ending sectarian wars, meant to
Yes.
pretty much divide everybody and perhaps like partition Syria.
And weaken the resistance, because for me, what was clear, every time there's a ceasefire, it's a gateway to a new violation. It's a gateway to an increase in Zionist activity against the resistance. And this is exactly what happened after the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. They pivoted to Syria, and we know what happened after that. With every ceasefire in Gaza, we see an increase in the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And equally, when we had the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, I immediately said this means they will pivot to Hezbollah, to the Iraqi resistance, and they'll weaponize Jolani. And this is part of the security agreement, is that he will become a regional enforcer for the Zionists, and he will be used, and his Takfiri elements will be used to target Hezbollah and the PMF and any other resistance forces. I don't know if you remember, there was an interview with Jolani in Arabic back in 2015, where he talked about his agenda being to cut the hands of Iran, in other words, to weaken and destroy the resistance axis. And then he would be used also against Iran, both triggering Takfiri elements inside Iran and on the borders with Iran. This is what he said.
Yeah, I mean, I also remember like when he self-elected himself to become the president of Syria, he clearly said that Israel is not an enemy and that the enemy is Hezbollah and Iran. So, yeah, it's clearly obvious what he wants to do in this region, I guess. Raed, please jump in whenever you want to.
Yes, hi Vanessa.
Hi.
Always perfect. I mean, the analysis was great. You definitely have your finger on the pulse. So I'm going to try to pick your brain about a couple of things. The first question would be: remember when they rebranded Al Qaeda into HTS, and then they created the Syrian Democratic, and then they suddenly started calling them moderate rebels and all that. You think that the Arab tribal kind of heading is just sort of a rebranding of ISIS, basically, or is there a big faction of Arab tribes that are really joining that force?
I think it's quite complex. I was actually just writing about this. I think there are something like 6 main tribes in Syria. And among those, there's something like 41 groups under that umbrella that have joined Jolani's jihad, which is how they're describing it, against the Druze. And of course, there have been orchestrated events that have turned the tribal factions against the Druze. And the Druze have actually said, like, many of these events didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
So clearly it is being orchestrated. Many within those tribal factions have different ideology from what I understand. Some are allied with the SDF, some are allied with ISIS, some are allied with Jolani. You know, with the tribal factions, I see them very much as opportunists. It's a question of survival to a large degree for the tribes, and that's what Jolani is kind of exploiting. He's exploiting their survivalist reflex for them to become actually genocidal against what they perceive to be a threat, because that's what Jelani is telling them through the media and through his statements and through his social media cohorts. Actually, also I've seen Telegram channels kind of literally stirring discourse against the Druze and presenting situations that are not real, like the hanging of bodies from a bridge that wasn't even in Sweden, you know. And so it's very clear to me that the tribes they're not a cohesive force, but they're a force that will be brought together by shared interest. I think that's kind of how I would perceive it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my question would be, and I understand if you don't want to delve into that element. So what I perceived that is the dynamic within Syria, and that's just my analysis and vision, that there are also a little bit of a tug and pull within Syria in terms of regional power. So when we look at these events between these factions and the Druze community, can we place Qatar and UAE? So Qatar, it's Qatar and Turkey, basically, if I'm not mistaken, and then UAE and Saudi Arabia. Can we place them all on the same agenda? Because I have like with all these tribes mobilizing from all over the place, that says to me that internal intelligence, the intelligence assets have said, yeah, go ahead. There's a green light somewhere that has been given all over the place. Can you unpack a little bit?
I think Turkey is not on board fully with this, in my opinion. It was Turkey that actually kind of whisked Jolani to safety to Latakia when Israel started bombing Damascus. And they took him to Latakia and they kept him there under protection. But I think what we're seeing, and this is just my reading of it, you may have a completely different reading. What I'm seeing is Jolani doing exactly what he did when he effectively betrayed al-Baghdadi, and he left ISIS and he formed Nusra Front al-Qaeda in Syria. And then, as you rightly said, he later tried to distance himself from al-Qaeda under instructions from MI6 and CIA and his handlers into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. But I think he's doing the same thing now. So he piggybacked into power very much with Turkey's support. But the Syrian National Army, which is directly under the control of Turkey and consists mainly of the Muslim Brotherhood, former Free Syrian Army, are challengers to Jolani's power. They have directly challenged him multiple times, and they have refused to be integrated under the HTS military and regime. And I think Turkey sees both the Saudi influence and the Israeli influence as a threat to his role as the leader of the caliphate, which is very much how he tries to portray himself. And so the reason that he wants a unified Syria is so that he has control. But of course, what have we seen? While Israel and Turkey are clearly allies, when Turkey has tried to extend into central Syria and to give HTS air defense and to establish Turkish military outposts further into Syrian territory, Israel has bombed him. Right. So I think while there is an alliance of convenience, I think ultimately there is a clash between the Greater Israel Project and the neo-Ottoman agenda of Erdogan. And so while he's not going to say that publicly, I don't think he's in favor of the increased Saudi and UAE influence, which is very much allied. UAE, of course, is already normalized with Israel. It is very much embedded with Israel, particularly in the kind of tech surveillance area that we know has been weaponized against Palestinians with devastating consequences. And Saudi Arabia, again, is very much trying to expand its power through the US and through Israel. In my opinion, I don't think Saudi Arabia is in a position to actually achieve a stake in Syria's future right now. Again, you could prove me wrong. And I think Qatar is very much aligned with Turkey. So Qatar will be feeling very much the same about what is going on, in my opinion.
Mm. No, I completely agree with I completely agree with everything. The way I see it is, yes, like everybody falls under the large Washington NATO umbrella, but under that umbrella, I think there's a little bit of a contradiction where I think Balkanization and the division of Syria into these ethnic states is something
Yes.
that Erdogan sees as a nightmare, because he doesn't want a Kurdish autonomous, so-called autonomous. So he doesn't want the Kurds to have a part of Syria for themselves, and I think this is where he's going to try to push back as much as he can, and then eventually, the way I see it, to put it simply, and then Washington is going to have to tell him who's boss and what plan is going to go. If I'm not mistaken, absolutely. One more thing, so we can if we pan out, basically this is the implementation of the greater Israel in terms of geopolitics, and like you said, the David Corridor is the tool or the tactic to project influence onwards. But then now we're very close to the dynamic within Iraq. Do you what's your general vision of what might be starting to be conspiracies or pitting people against each other between America and Washington having so much influence on the official governments in Iraq, and then that David Corridor, which gives those factions and Israel access very close to their border? What do you see as a certain, probable scenario of things coming up in Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest threats is if Jolani gets control of the ISIS holding camps in the northeast, which of course the US has been also weaponizing in Syria and in Iraq for some time. So I think for me, it comes back to this claim that Trump has lifted sanctions on Jolani and has lifted the foreign terrorist designation. But in reality, it's meaningless because the Caesar sanctions are still in place. Lifting the foreign terrorist designation only means that Jolani and his administration can travel, but no one effectively can supply them with weapons. No one can finance them under the existing terrorist designation. And Syria is actually, as far as I know, still designated as a sponsor of terrorism as a state. I don't think that has been lifted. And ironically, some of the sanctions that were lifted, among them were actually sanctions against former President Assad. So I don't think Jolani was particularly happy with that result. And I think Shaibani actually made the point to Rubio that he hoped that more was going to be done in the future. So Jolani is still very much under the microscope, let's say. I am hearing rumors that maybe Washington will bring in Abdi, Mohammed Abdi, the Kurdish commander. I think that is not something that I think is feasible right now because it's going to tip Turkey over the edge. I think if you were to bring in any sort of Kurdish replacement for Jolani, I think they still need Jolani. Because he does have control of the core Takfiri militia, including the foreign militia, which see him now very much as a savior because Trump was originally saying they had to leave Syria. It's now been negotiated that they stay. So they actually do see Jolani as a savior of their existence inside Syria and the possibility of achieving their caliphate dreams, right?
Yeah.
So I think it would be very difficult to replace Jolani right now. But I think there is strong potential. When we look at how the country might be carved up, Jolani would be left with the corridor from Hama, Idlib, Hama, Homs. And Homs, the governorate, of course, stretches through Palmyra, the Syrian Badia, the desert, to the Iraqi border. Now, this is, in my opinion, very important because this provides a corridor for ISIS to transit from both Iraq through Syria and into Lebanon and back again, right?
Yeah.
And it also provides a corridor where Jolani and his Takfiri elements can prevent the PMF from coming, for example, to the aid of Hezbollah should anything escalate against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is looking fairly likely with the rhetoric that's being put forward by Tom Barrack and Trump and Jolani and so on. And we know that this is what Israel wants to do. It knows that it can't, it's not going to achieve the disarmament of Hezbollah, that's for sure. It can create political discord within Lebanon, as I'm sure you know. And I think it can keep the Lebanese army and Hezbollah occupied. Between the Takfiris and Israel, they can keep Hezbollah constantly in a state of alert and readiness. And if the war re-escalates or reignites against Iran, I think this is the objective, to keep the Iraqi resistance occupied, to keep Hezbollah occupied. So should there be a need, Iran hasn't actually asked for anyone to intervene in the last 12-day war, but we don't know what might happen in the future. And so I think this is what this is about. It's about providing the environment in which the Iraqi and the Lebanese resistance are bogged down in what would turn out to be a very long war with Takfiri elements both within their territory and on their borders.
Yeah, I fully agree. The ISIS presence is just like a mud and a quagmire just to get the resistance busy and engaged and not really focused 100% on Israel. All right, let me ask you a quick question, and then we can see if anyone has a question, they can raise their hand. So we discussed a little bit Syria at length, a little bit of the possibilities of what we might see in Iraq. What do you think the plan is with regards to Lebanon, with all that changes that took place in Syria and ISIS presence and all that, and what Tom Barrack is today's, that guy. So
yeah.
Wow. And the guy, I mean, I heard, and I cannot confirm or deny, but I heard that he's an Epstein kind of guy. He used to roll with Epstein back in the day. So that tells you so much. Yeah, absolutely. He's part of the tribe. So tell me, what do you see? What do you see? What do you like? What do you forecast or foresee the plan, the Zionist plan would be now in terms of tactically in Lebanon? What would they kind of try to do? Do you see any mobilization of a big force invading, the eastern border, or is just terrorism and vandalization and terror cells here? Like what kind of scenario?
It's quite difficult to read. I find it quite interesting that very recently Jolani's militia have been focusing very much on Homs and ethnically cleansing and resettling the Takfiri elements there, which of course it has an interest from the hydrocarbon point of view. And as I mentioned, the corridor from Iraq through to Lebanon. But I think this is a clear indication that there is going to be an increase in pressure on the border. I'm not convinced that there will be an invasion, but I'm very careful of saying things like that because nobody ever expected Syria to fall in 10 days. So I think we always have to keep very alert as to, potential incoming plans that we haven't considered. But I do think after the failure of the attempted invasion and being pushed back by the tribes, basically, in the Bekaa. And then, of course, by the Lebanese army that reinforced the tribal front in Lebanon. I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I did read, and I don't know if you can confirm, that the resistance, Hezbollah, is preparing for some kind of action along the border, along the eastern border. And of course, then that combines with, we've seen protests in Tripoli. I don't know how big they were, but we've been hearing about them in sympathy with Jolani and the tribes in Syria against the Druze. So I wonder if they're not going to try and escalate sectarian divisions inside Lebanon. As I said, they're not going to achieve the disarmament. Are they going to use it as a political weapon against Hezbollah to turn certain factions and communities in Lebanon against Hezbollah again? I really don't know, because the Takfiri threat, and particularly Syrian Takfiri threat, for the majority of Lebanese is going to be a red line, right?
Yes.
And so therefore the majority of the population would support any resistance that can push back against that kind of military activity. That's
Sure.
different to Israel. So I'm really not sure if they're going to actually risk an all-out invasion, because I think it could turn the tide in favor of the resistance in Lebanon, which is what they want to avoid at all costs.
Yeah.
And so I think, Barak is basically an economic hitman. I think he'll maintain the economic pressure on the Lebanese government to try and push them to put pressure on Hezbollah, which again, I don't think is going to work. But as regards actual invasion, of course, Israel is pretty much doing what it wants in the south on a daily basis and hunting down both civilians and members of the resistance on a almost hourly basis. I think I'm not seeing a completely clear policy as regards Lebanon, other than to bog Hezbollah down in military operations, either against the Takfiri or against Israel.
Yeah. I don't think any analyst or anyone can foresee it. Really, it is so fluid that we know the ultimate aim. Absolutely, disarming Hezbollah is I tell you, as a Lebanese and as somehow a little bit in the know, this is a dream. Like, no way, there is no way on earth
I know
anyone is taking one bullet, one shot out of Hezbollah. But of course, they're going to try everything. I mean, but Tom Barak, imagine. So now you got a U.S. envoy for Syria and Lebanon, speaking officially as an official for American official, that tells us today that all the ceasefire doesn't look like it's going to work, like it's not working, and we can't do anything about it. And the other statement along the lines that we can't pressure Israel. It's like you Americans guaranteed that ceasefire, that Israel will withdraw from Lebanon, and Israel hasn't done its side of the deal. Like, it hasn't it hasn't delivered on what it's supposed to deliver according to the ceasefire that you guys guaranteed. And now you're telling us that you can't ask Israel to do anything, and that ceasefire that looks flimsy. And it is like, really, in diplomatic terms, we've seen the Americans' behavior for the last 7 decades, but this time around it's just becoming amateurish, silly, pathetic, and really yeah. All right, so if anyone has any question, you can raise your hand. Firstblood, right, and then you'll manage until time's up. Thanks a lot, Vanessa. Thank you.
I just wanted to answer to Vanessa. There's nothing official from Hezbollah regarding any kind of preparation or anything. I mean, the last speech of Sheikh Naim Qasim was extremely clear He, for the first time, addressed this existential threat that Lebanon is facing as a whole. Not only the resistance by what's going on in Syria, because, like, historically speaking, Syria and Lebanon has always been linked, and anything that happens in Syria obviously directly impact Lebanon because there's shared communities and shared history, etc. So he mentioned the threat from the east with the Takfiri. He mentioned the threat from the south with the Israelis, and he also mentioned the American hegemony who's trying to I mean, they already control Lebanese politics, but they're trying to do it even further to cripple the country, whether it's economically, etc., etc. But nothing specific was ordered. But I imagine that they are taking their precautions and they are preparing for this kind of scenario, which, like you said, everybody in Lebanon believes now that it's most likely. There was multiple reports of Takfiri groups, just literally on the border, waiting for like some kind of offensive. And we've seen it before. I mean, they tried once. It lasted for like 3 or 4 days, and they failed miserably against the Lebanese tribes of the Bekaa. So I think that even those in Lebanon right now that align with the U.S. agenda, after seeing what happened in Sweden and what happened in Tartus and in Latakia regarding the ongoing ethnic cleansing, many of their supporters, I'm not saying the politicians, because those ones are, pretty much serving the Zionists and the American agenda in the region. So they will never change their position. But their supporters are now, from what I've seen from social media and even from people on the ground, they are acknowledging that in case of this Takfiri invasion happen from the north, who will be able to stop them? Like they understand that without the resistance, there's no way. Like the same thing that happened in Latakia and Tartus and Sueda and other parts, Homs, will happen to them too. So now their position is like a little bit more per se, like understanding of the realities, and they're trying. They're getting away from the delusions of the American so-called. وصية شو الوصية Raed in English? I forgot the word. Guardianship, from the American guardianship, because like, I mean, Tom Barak, I don't know, this guy, I think he's a blessing in disguise despite being a curse. When he mentioned that, when he says that there's nothing we can do about Israel, and I mean, he's clearly showing those who support him and his policies in Lebanon that in case anything happens, don't count on us. We can't do anything for you. It's only your business. So it is a good thing, But regarding like the Israeli presence in Syria, one day after the fall of Assad, Netanyahu made this famous video from Mount Hermon. And people, I think, understand in terms of military what it means to have Mount Hermon, and how like important for them it is, and how much of a threat it's for the rest of the people in the region. Not only the resistance in Lebanon and Syria, by the way, like even Jordan and Saudi Arabia along the line, even Turkey. But what about the water, which nobody talks about? Can you, I know that you've talked about it multiple times. Can you tell us what are they doing with the Syrian water over there?
Well, of course, the whole region that one of the main reasons that they occupied the Golan Territory, the Syrian Golan Territory, that they did in 1967, was that it supplies 30% of Israel's water. But also the areas that they moved into, the Yarmouk Basin, even Mount Hermon has a considerable water basin from the snows and the rain and the winter. But the Yarmouk Basin particularly supplies both Jordan and Syria with a large percentage of their water. And in fact, there are huge water shortages in Syria this year, not only because of the lack of the rain in the winter. And the David corridor is, of course, all about reaching the Euphrates and the water supply from that. But this, again, is kind of interesting to me, because Turkey has control of the dam system of the Euphrates. We know that, of course, because they cut it off to deprive the 2 million people in Hasakah in the northeast of Syria multiple times. And so I think this is where I say that the alliance between Turkey and Israel is not an easy one, but they need each other. So I think, we're not going to see an out-and-out conflict between the two, because Turkey needs Israel and Israel needs Turkey. But at some point, I do think there's going to be a degree of clash between them over their unshared agendas, let's say. But yeah, you know, the capture of water is actually almost more important these days, in my opinion, than the capture of oil and hydrocarbons.
Absolutely true on the point of water. It is the finite resource these days, and because it is much more finite than hydrocarbons, and Israel has had always a consistent water resource problem, and they're definitely coming for the water. Absolutely true. If anyone has a question, I guess you can raise your hand.
I mean, I
Right.
think we pretty much covered everything, and people usually don't ask questions on my platform because they know I don't allow like trolls, and I don't allow like, you know, MI6 agents and bad faith actors. But like Vanessa, you said something very interesting to me earlier, and I know that there's a lot of question marks, and I don't know if you want to get into it, but like about the fall of Assad and the role of Russia into this, because you said that Russia seems to be more aligned now with Israel regarding the, you know, to be able to save its assets in on the coast, right? Like the Hamamim air base and other stuff. Do you think they're doing this because they understand that the Americans only see, like you said, the situations here from the Israeli lens? Then they know that there's no chance with the Turks to be able to guarantee anything. And we've seen, I mean, I don't remember when it was, like a couple of months ago, there was an airbase, the K2, I think, the airbase near Palmyra, that Turkey was reportedly trying to establish, you know, for some air defense systems over there, and Israel completely destroyed it, sending a clear message to Erdogan that, you know, you will not set foot over here, and you know, this is our land now. So what can you tell us more about this Russian-Israeli rapprochement about the situation in Syria?
Well, I think one of the mistakes that Syria made and the leadership made was in believing that Russia was an ideological ally, similar to what the Soviet Union had been previously. And I think, unfortunately, the fall of Syria and Russia did, in my opinion, play a role in that. And I was on the ground during the last days and witnessing what actually happened within the army and within the Syrian army command. I think ultimately there were a number of things that for them became untenable for them to maintain their support for President Assad. One, I think Russia was pushing him towards UAE and Saudi Arabia. And ultimately, of course, that would mean a degree of collaboration with countries that were clearly, in the case of UAE, already normalized, with Israel and Saudi Arabia, you know, de facto normalized, even though it's not making the full public move yet officially. And I think finally, or two things, I think there was President Assad dragging his heels over forming the new constitution, which was a big issue for Russia. And finally, not coming to the negotiating table with President Erdogan. And many people have said to me, yes, but why should he? Because Erdogan had annexed territory, you know, because of Erdogan's role in the filthy war against Syria since 2011. But my response always is that Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, met with everyone. He didn't capitulate, but he met with everyone. And I think that was again one of the reasons that Russia finally kind of threw the towel in. Plus, it combined with the election of Trump, and Trump, when he's elected, always brings in this belief that deals can be made and negotiations can be done. And this was particularly in relation to, obviously, Ukraine and Russia. But I think going forward, initially, Trump was very clear that he would only give Giuliani the assurances he needed and the backup that he needed if Russia did not remain in Syria. And then Israel actually started lobbying for Russia to remain. That was very clear from Israeli media that this is what they were doing. And at that point, that condition was taken off the table and the US has stopped talking about it in Syria. So in my opinion, Israel lobbied for Russia to stay because they see the alliance as a way to prevent Erdogan's expansion and to keep an Israeli alliance in control of the coastal area. And not forgetting that Russia had the exploration rights to the Levant gas off the coast of Syria from 2013 onwards. So the last thing they would want to see is Turkey getting its hands on it, which, of course, Erdogan was trying to do almost immediately after the fall of Damascus. So again, I think what we're seeing in Syria now is a sort of a constant maneuvering of regional players that brought about the fall of Syria and who are now trying to carve it up to their benefit. But of course, Russia is, in their view, I'm presuming, feel that they're better placed as an ally of Israel than they are as an ally of Turkey.
I see. So just to be respectful of your time, this is something that I'm working on because I usually extend the spaces. I think we're approaching the end of it. So if you have any lasting words, I mean, I know that you have, regarding your work, I've been following it for years, Raed also, and you've been one of the, main Western voices in Syria alongside Tim Anderson and Patrick Henningsen and others who challenged constantly the mainstream media narrative. What can you tell us right now? And I'll give you the ending, whatever you want to say as an out of this space regarding like the Western mainstream media. What is the biggest misconception that they are saying, and what can you tell the people about it?
Oh, there are so many. I see that Dr. Piers Robinson is listening, and he's the best person to follow and go to for reports on the OPCW corruption and production of the fake reports on the alleged Syrian government chemical attacks. But I think what people need to bear in mind is that now Syria is a vacuum for misinformation, because there's literally nobody on the ground that is able to report on the reality as there was. There weren't many of us, but at least we were there. Now there's nobody, and so therefore the news itself is basically being channeled by the Takfiri elements and their intelligence agency handlers, whether that's MI6 or CIA or Turkish or Mossad, it doesn't matter. They're in control of the narrative, and that's what people really need to be aware of. And the one thing that I've really seen rearing its head, particularly on social media, that I wanted to mention is this narrative that all Sunnis in Syria are Takfiri. This is absolute nonsense, and this is effectively trying to sow sectarian division, particularly against the Syrians in Lebanon. I'm seeing it from Lebanese accounts, supposedly Lebanese accounts, supposedly Iranian accounts, but it's gathering traction. And I think it's a very dangerous narrative, because that serves, again, the divisive divide and rule tactics of the collective West and the Zionist bloc. And I want to be absolutely clear about this. You can't you can't put Syria, which is an incredibly diverse and complex landscape, into one basket or under one label. It's impossible. And I think we as commentators, and I know you all do, thank God, we have to be very adamant about this and be pushing back very hard against these attempts to basically criminalize all Syrians because of what Jolani and the Takfiri elements are doing, both inside Syria and potentially further afield.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I mean, I think it's part of the media warfare, right? And the psychological warfare, where they boost this kind of rhetoric. And I've seen it from many accounts that I don't even follow. I don't know. They just pop up, and I wrote about it multiple times to try and raise awareness, because these small sectarian provocative statements are
Yeah.
just meant for the people to not see the bigger picture. Like you said, the divide and conquer element that they are doing right now in Syria. And I'm pretty sure that they have the same aspirations to Iraq and to Lebanon.
Yeah.
But I guess time will tell. But yeah, I mean, Vanessa, once again, thank you so much for your time. This space was much needed. It's been a while since I've been trying to plan this one. Perhaps maybe in the future we can have a little bit more time to dive a little bit more into the history, or like perhaps the current events, because it's so chaotic, right? Every day we wake
Yeah.
up and there's atrocities everywhere, and there's new stuff everywhere.
Mhm.
So it obviously needs time. But thank you so much. And for those who are listening, and Mr. Pierce Robertson, I would love to have you too one day. I just followed you because I didn't know that you had a Twitter account. I used to watch multiple interviews from YouTube, etc. Vanessa, where can the people find you? I know that you have a YouTube channel, and where else?
Yeah. On YouTube, X, Telegram, and I have a Substack where most of my articles are published, and ukcolumn.org.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for your time. Thank you, Raed, for co-hosting.
Thank you, and
This
thank you
space,
also so much.
No,
this
thank
space
you
is
for having me
recorded.
on.
Yeah, this space is recorded. So for anyone who missed the beginning, you can watch it once I close it. And on that note, thank you all so much for coming, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Thanks a lot, First Blood. Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
opportunity. Thank you, guys.